Good morning, and I'd like to thank you for joining us here once again at the Greenbrier Church Online as we continue our look at the series, No Vacancy. Back in 2001, John Grisham published a book called Skipping Christmas. The story focuses on Luther and Nora Crank and the fact that their only daughter, has chosen to spend a year in Peru working for the Peace Corps. It really shakes up Nora because Christmas is a big deal in their family. They always have Christmas decorations, and they have this big Christmas Eve party where the whole neighborhood is invited to come and to spend time with them. And she's worried about how life is going to be. And so Luther makes the suggestion that instead of spending all this time and money on Christmas, maybe they ought to use their money to go on a cruise. At first, Nora isn't really keen on the idea, but she begins to warm up to it. And they begin to tell their neighbors that this year there's no Black Friday shopping, no yard decorations, no Christmas tree, and no Christmas Eve party. Their neighbors don't deal well with the news, neither do the local charities, and very soon the Cranks find themselves as outcasts in their own community. But the plot twists because their daughter calls them on Christmas Eve to tell them that she's on her way home to be home in time for the party and to celebrate Christmas with her family. In an instant, the Cranks have to scramble to make preparations to celebrate Christmas, and their neighbors all jump in and help them save the day as well as the season. I really enjoyed the story, not because it's funny and well written, which it is. I enjoy the story because I understand the stress of the holidays. Every one of us has a story about holiday stress, which is kind of weird since the holidays are supposed to be a time of peace on earth and goodwill towards man. I believe that the best part of Christmas is getting to spend time with my family and people that I love. I also believe that the worst part of Christmas is being together with members of my family and people that I love. What I mean is that while Christmas is always better spent with family, a lot of times the season is a time of stress because we stress out being associated with our family. Maybe because we've made some mistakes in our past relationships, or maybe we're at a different place in our lives, or we have differences politically or socially, and that's caused there to be anger and heartache and confusion rather than peace and goodwill. But the truth is that stress doesn't just happen in the holidays because of our family. You could say the exact same thing about a Tuesday. I've always liked the fact that we call the church a family. There's a lot of truth in that. And while our church family was created to be a place of love and acceptance and healing, there are times when it falls short of the ideal. We've looked over the last 6 weeks at the fact that sometimes the church is not a place where everyone is accepted. During this series, I've tried to be really honest with the scriptures and especially with my own humanity. I deeply believe that everyone would shout out from the rooftops that we want the church to grow. But just like in the pages of Scripture, there are some folks that I wish would go to church somewhere else. Sometimes we don't want people to come and join our church because we're afraid of them. Sometimes we don't want people to come be part of our church family because they have a different background or they've made different life choices. And the truth is, sometimes I want the church to grow, but if you're a part of my family, I'd really like for it to grow somewhere else. I'm sure at first blush you would say, Jeremy, that's absurd. Every parent would love to have their child worshiping with them. That's true. And there are many of us who would love the opportunity to worship with our parents. But I want you to think, is that really the family member that we're talking about? You see, when I talk about my family, I talk about Trista. I talk about Trafton, I talk about Ryland, I talk about my mom and dad or Trista's mom and dad, and we tend to act like our family tree stops there. When we talk about our family, we talk about the family that we're fond of, the people that we're proud of, the people that are like us. That's our family. But there are other members of your family as well, family members that we choose not to think about and talk about, like that third cousin twice removed that spent more time in prison than they have a bathtub. There are people that we bump into in the family reunions that we're not really close enough to know their name or to be kin with them, regardless of our bloodline. Every week we've gone to Scripture and we've seen that wanting the church to grow but not wanting certain people is not a Greenbrier problem. It's not a Alabama problem or an American problem. It's a human problem. And once again this morning, we're going to be able to get into the Scripture and we're going to see that sometimes we want the church to grow, we just don't want our family to show up. I want you to look with me in Luke chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 11. Once there was this man who had two sons. One day the younger son came to his father and said, "Father, eventually I'm going to inherit my share of your estate. Rather than waiting until you die, I want you to give me my share now." And so the father liquidated assets and divided them. A few days passed, and the younger son gathered all of his wealth and set off on a journey to a distant land. Once there, he wasted everything he owned on wild living. He was broke. A terrible famine struck that land, and he felt desperately hungry and in need. He got a job with one of the locals, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. The young man felt so miserably hungry that he wished he could eat the slop the pigs were eating. Nobody gave him anything. The young man in this parable was a lot like a young girl that Trista and I know. She told me one time, "Hey guys, the only time that I'm homesick is when I'm at home." Her greatest desire in life was to be anywhere but with her family. And that's exactly where the younger son was in this parable. He was the family rebel, the renegade, and he was impulsive. And this idea of doing things the acceptable way wasn't acceptable to him. You see, there was this big old world out there that was full of wonder and excitement and all of these things that I could get involved in. In order to do that, I've got to get out of Dad's house. There's more exciting things in the world than there are here. The truth is that family member that we like to pretend that belongs to another family, they're not always a distant relative, are they? There's family that we don't talk about in public. It's not always a cousin or an uncle. Sometimes the family that we don't talk about is our mom or our dad or our brother or our sister or our child. And it's not that they're a little off or a little weird. It's that they've spent their own time with prostitutes and drunks. They've wasted their money on wild parties. And the only thing they have to show for it is regret. We all want to project this illusion that we're refined and respectable. But the truth is, if you knew my real family, then that illusion would get shattered. That's the reason that when you're dating somebody, there are certain family members it's okay to introduce them to, and certain family members that you hide until after you say, "I do." You see, once the wedding's over, then it's okay to pull out the family album and show them all of our crazy. Not only did the young man in the text waste everything, just when you think you get to rock bottom, he seems to find a shovel and start digging. Here we have a good Jewish boy, or at least a Jewish boy, going out working with pigs, with unclean animals. And then he digs a little deeper because he's so hungry, he longs to eat the slop that they're feeding unclean animals. He doesn't just disgrace his family. Apparently, there are members of his family that wished he would just disappear and fall off the face of the earth altogether, never to be seen again. At least that's what we get in the text starting in verse 25. Now, the man's older son was still out in the fields working. He came home at the end of the day and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked, What's going on? The servant said, "Your brother has returned, and your father has butchered the fattest calf to celebrate his safe return." The older brother got really angry and refused to come inside, so his father came out and pleaded with him to join the celebration, but he argued back, "Listen, all these years I've worked hard for you. I've never disobeyed one of your orders, but how many times have you given me a little goat to roast for a party with my friends? Not once. This is not fair. So this son of yours comes, this wasteful delinquent who has spent your hard-earned wealth on loose women, and what do? You butchered the fattest calf from our herd. The older son has spent the day out working in the fields, and it's not until he comes home and he hears the music and dancing that he hears and discovers that his brothers come home. Nobody even thought to go out into the field and to tell him about it. And honestly, that's just fine. The outcast has come crawling home from doing who knows what with who knows who, and respectable people don't associate with those kind of folks. It doesn't matter if we share DNA or not. That little brother died the day he walked out of the house. It's really easy to get hard on the older brother, but before we do that, we need to think, can we understand where he's coming from, or at least relate just a little bit to his plight? This older brother was livid that his degenerate, ungrateful brother, this reprobate, was welcomed back into our home with open arms. We don't like that kind of grace being extended to other people. You see, he was arrogant in thinking that his brother was a worse sinner than he was, that he deserved less grace. He's resentful that his brother got to go off and to have a good time and to enjoy the world and the trappings of the world while he labored at the house. And now that little brother's getting grace. That's not fair. That's not the way the story's supposed to be told. You see, the older brother's homesick as well. It's not as strange as you might think. As a matter of fact, there have been several times during the years that I've had folks tell me they don't want their family coming to worship with us. Okay, they might not have used those exact words, but they've been really clear about their intentions. You see, you need to understand that not everyone wants their family here, because they don't want to be embarrassed by their family. They don't want their family here because they're trying to protect themselves. And so instead of inviting the family, instead of throwing open the doors and saying, we want the church to grow and we want our family here, we would prefer to just hang a no vacancy sign and tell them that we're full. I want to share a few stories with you this morning that hopefully will explain what I mean. First story. Sometimes we don't want our families to come to church with us because we're afraid it's going to cause an argument. One of the first churches that we ever worked with, there was this wonderful lady who was a part of our church. She always had a smile on her face. She was full of joy. She was compassionate. And everybody just wanted to be around her. One day I was at the building and I heard somebody out cutting the grass at the church. And I went out to introduce myself to them. That's the day that I found out that this wonderful lady in our congregation was married. Her husband would often come to the building and do things around the church for us, like cut the grass or change light bulbs, but he never once showed up to a family gathering. So I asked her one day to tell me a bit about what was going on with her husband, and she said, please, Jeremy, don't talk to him about church. She went on to explain that the problem stemmed from an incident that happened at a funeral. There was a time when their whole family came to church, but their son died in an accident. They had the funeral at the building, and during the funeral, they invited people to come up and to say things that they remembered about their son. Everything was going great until this older man came up and stood in front of the church and put his hand on the casket and said, this young man was not a good man. He did not live a good life, and now he's burning in hell. And if you don't get your life straight, you'll be there with him. One remark made in ignorance caused this wonderful lady to put up a no vacancy sign for her husband. Her husband was kind. He was compassionate. He would do anything that we asked him to do, but his family was hurt. He was hurt. And what happened on that day drove a wedge between him and God and him and his wife. He wanted nothing to do with Christianity, nothing to do with God, and he hated the fact that his wife did, that she still went to church and worshiped in that building with those people. She believed that any discussion that I would have with her husband would just reopen old wounds, so it was better for her marriage if I just stayed away. You see, if I talk to him, it would cause another argument, and it's just easier to hang a no vacancy sign. Next story. There are times when people have not wanted their family members approached because they're afraid that we would think they were a poor excuse as a Christian. Tristan and I worked at a church family where we had the pleasure to be friends with this wonderful couple. They were funny and warm, and we'd not been working with that congregation very long when the husband shows up at the church building and sits down in my office with a cup of coffee. He said we needed to talk. It was during that conversation that he informed me that his wife wasn't a Christian, that he'd been talking to her about Jesus for over 20 years, and the last thing he needed was for me to come in and to add to her confusion. He said, Jeremy, it's my job as her husband to convert her. You're the preacher. You need to know your place. The couple had a great marriage. They were a blessing to me and to my family, but this man believed it was his job to handle the spiritual aspects of their home. And if he was a real Christian, he had to be the one to convert his wife. And if he had to have help, well, then he wasn't a good Christian. And so, in an effort to save face, he just hung out a no vacancy sign for his wife. Third story. Sometimes we don't want our family to come because we're comfortable in our role. Trista and I worshiped at a church where there was a woman whose husband liked to drink a lot. She was faithful. She took care of her husband. She loved him deeply. But I noticed that her conversations often drifted into a discussion about her husband's alcoholism. Other people often offered her sympathy and would say things like, you're such a godly woman to stay with a man that's struggling with addiction, or you're a stronger Christian than I am to love somebody who seems to be so unlovable. One night her husband had a car wreck, and it changed his life. He sobered up, and he decided he was going to be the husband he was supposed to be. He gave his life to Christ, and he started attending family gatherings, and that's when their marriage went south. You see, oftentimes this story plays out the exact same way. There's a spouse that is the saint in the relationship, and there's a spouse that's the sinner. And when the sinner cleans up their life, well, then the saint's no longer the saint. They no longer receive the same encouragement or attention. They don't ask for the change, and they're not comfortable in their new role. And so sometimes, for the sake of what's comfortable, we hang out a no vacancy sign. Because it's easier to say, no, I don't want my family to come to be part of the church than it is for me to change my role. There are other reasons that we don't want our family members to come to Christ as well. There are some people that know the dedication of their spouse to anything that they believe in, and if they were to be converted, they're going to have to make some changes. And I like being comfortable. I like to come to church and to sit in a pew and feel pretty good about my relationship with God. I like the fact that my relationship with God is no fuss. There are no demands. It's just this safe little relationship. And if my family member comes to God, if my family member has the audacity to love Christ as much as they love college football, then things are going to have to change. And I know I say that a little tongue-in-cheek, but have you ever seen anybody as excited about Christ and about God as they are about college football? If a member of my family gets over-dedicated to Christ, then my safe, non-assuming relationship with God is over. I'm going to have to work on forging a deeper relationship with God as well. And, I'd rather be comfortable. I'd rather just be acquainted with Christ. And so instead of getting too deeply involved, I'm just going to tell my family they're not welcome here. I'm going to hang out a no vacancy sign. Sometimes I don't want my family here because when they show up, it ruins everything. They might steal my spotlight. They might make me feel small and inadequate. We could take the next couple hours talking about all of the reasons that people have for not wanting their own family here. I fully understand that there's not a good reason to not want your family here, but we have this remarkable ability to do all kinds of ignorant things for no good reason. I lost my ability to be surprised and amazed at the brokenness of people a long time ago because I know me and I know us. What we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, what does God want? I believe that God tells us He wants His church to be healthy, and healthy churches grow. But sometimes in our sickness, we would rather put up a no vacancy sign than do the difficult work of rooting out our dysfunction and our desire to be the greatest in the kingdom. We would rather enjoy our dysfunction than do the hard work of finding real spiritual health. And we need to make sure that we have not become so abnormal that church growth is seen as a bad thing. This morning, we're going to make our way to the tables. And once again, I need to emphasize the fact that growth happens at the table, because it's at the table that I'm forced to recognize my own unworthiness. I need to recognize the fact that Jesus died for my brokenness. But at the table, I also get to experience God's deep love for me. And once I've understood that, when I recognize your unworthiness, I also remember God's deep love for you as well, that His grace covers both of us, that's why both of us get to come to the table. You see, it's at the table we can experience God's full acceptance. It's at the table we are called to remember that we are guests. And while we often want to feign our own superiority, our own goodness, the truth is we are only allowed to come sit at the table because God invited us to join Him. We need to remember that Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Church, this morning, Jesus is reminding us that everyone is invited to share this time at the table, because everyone is welcome to come to His table to be part of His church and to be part of His kingdom. Over the last few weeks, I've asked you, do you want the church to grow? Do you really want the church to grow? And you've said, yes, you do. But this morning, we need to ask ourselves as we gather at the table, are we really willing to open our hearts and our fellowship to everyone that Jesus wants to come here? Because that's the only way we'll be healthy. That's the only way we'll be whole. That's the only way we will be the church that God intends for us to be. I hope you have a wonderful time of communion today around the table, a good discussion, and a great remembrance of the depth of God's love for you. I hope you have a great week. Go in peace, and I look forward to seeing you soon.